Good evening, brothers and sisters in Christ. This is Pastor Ray Branstetter, Pastor Messiah Lutheran Church in Urbana, Ohio, and chaplain at Mercy Hospital. Welcome. It is December 28th, our evening prayer and devotion. And for the third night in a row, it's a patron saint holiday. And this one's a bit different. This is December 28th, the Holy Innocents. The story of the slaughter of the babies, 2 years and younger baby boys in the village of Bethlehem, as the ruthless King Herod tried to eliminate this king that had been born, that the wise men had warned him of, or at least told him of, maybe not warned him of. Not a real pleasant text. It shows up occasionally in the Revised Common Lectionary. I think normally when this particular day falls on a Sunday. I know it's not the reading in the narrative lectionary for this weekend. I'm not sure about the Revised Common Lectionary. Haven't really looked at it yet. But it's an interesting story. It's one of those stories, part of the Christmas narrative. Doesn't make the children's Christmas pageant every year. It is left out, thank God. But it is there nonetheless, and it is in the Gospel of Matthew. And I want to share with you a little bit of a reading. This is from a Catholic publication. I always enjoy reading their view on things, particularly the saints. The Holy Innocents did not know Jesus, but they died in his place. December the 28th marks the feast of these baby boys, who are today recognized as the feast martyrs of babies. The story appears in the Gospel of Matthew. After Jesus' birth, King Herod the Great of Judah, named King of the Jews by the Roman Senate, learned of this newborn King of the Jews by the Magi. Troubled by the news, he deceivingly asked the Magi to report back to him Jesus' location, that, and I quote, I too may go and do him homage. But a dream warned the Magi not to return to Herod. Matthew 2:16 through 18 records what happens. When Herod realized that he had been deceived by the Magi, he became furious. He ordered the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had ascertained from the Magi. The Gospel reads, Then was fulfilled what had been through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be consoled, since they were no more. Since then, artists through the centuries, from Gito di Bodoni to Leon Cogniet and Vangelo Visconti, have captured the haunting moment of terrified mothers desperately clinging to their little ones. In music, the Coventry Carol, traditionally considered a Christmas carol, tells the story with an equally haunting tune. Herod the king, in his raging, set forth upon this day, by his decree no life spare thee, all children young to slay. And the lyrics go on, Then woe is me, poor child, for thee. The cover picture that I had on the cover today is not some of the gruesome paintings that I found online. I never know if little kids are watching, but this is a very interesting painting of Jesus surrounded by those innocents up in heaven. And this was on the Catholic page, and in honesty, I couldn't tell you who the artist is, but there you go. So, fact versus fiction. And I'll remind you, this is the Catholic point of view, which is fine. This is a story, has, as you'll hear, has no proof outside of the Bible, which doesn't always mean it didn't happen. Some historians dispute Matthew's account because Herod's biographers, such as Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, does not write about the slaughter. Catholic apologist Trent Horn responds to this argument in Catholic Answers, a part of the publication of this magazine. Such an act, he writes, of cruelty perfectly corresponds with Herod's paranoid and merciless character, which bolsters the argument for his historicity. Horn wrote in 2019. Josephus records that Herod was quick to execute anyone who perceived to be a threat to him and his rule, including his wife and children. Horn suggests that Josephus may not have considered the event notable. And I've heard this argument before. I've heard it when I was in Israel, when we went to Bethlehem in Palestine. The fact that Bethlehem was a tiny little village in those days, and the fact that Herod would do something like this was so in the ordinary that chances are pretty good it never got written down and never left, never became a part of the larger legend of Herod, except for in the little village of Bethlehem. So that's a little bit about this story. In our modern context, I often hear Jesus referred to, especially given the border situation over the last several years. What's going on the border is not new. It's been going on for a long time. I've heard Jesus called an immigrant. I've heard Jesus called a migrant. Both terms in our world today and in Jesus's time would not fit what was going on with Joseph and Jesus and Mary. Jesus was not an immigrant. He was not immigrating. Joseph was not immigrating to Egypt. He was escaping to Egypt to get away from Herod's murdering of the children. Remember, Joseph had been warned by an angel. So immigration implies that you move someplace and you stay there. My great-grandparents were immigrants from Norway. Your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, however back your family tree goes, were immigrants from someplace. So to call Jesus an immigrant, I would take an exception to. A migrant, migrants tend to be folks who travel from place to find employment. I can remember when I was a kid, and they still do. We have folks from the South travel up to work at some of our larger farms in the Urbana area. We'd see them in North Dakota. They journey where the work is, and sometimes they stay if they get a permanent job, but oftentimes, because we're generally associated with agricultural labor, they work through the season and then they go home. We saw that in California when I was stationed in Lemoore, California. So many of the farmers there employed migrants from Mexico. They came across the border. They worked in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley there. And once the harvest was picked and the fields were clean, they would go home to Mexico for various different reasons. Some of them obviously stayed, but a lot of them wanted to go home because that's where their families were at. They weren't particularly keen on the cold weather. And trust me, in what San Joaquin Valley at night, it could get really cold. And they were a critical part of the agricultural community, and they still are. God bless them. They're willing to do that work. And I just hope to get paid fair compensation for it. So, if we were to put Jesus's story in our terms today, Jesus would be considered a refugee. Joseph, Mary, and the baby were escaping Israel, Roman-occupied Israel, to save their life. And we are obligated as a signee of the Refugee Act from the UN to somebody comes to our border and they say they are there because they fear for their life at home. We are obligated to bring them in, and we are obligated to have them go before a refugee judge and to be judged refugee or not. And there's plenty of them who do that, and probably rightfully so. It would take a lot to get me to get up and walk from Nicaragua or Venezuela or one of those places all the way up to cross the river to the United States. They are coming here for the most part for the freedoms that our great grandparents came as well. But this isn't a political devotion. It's just trying to put that story, that important story, into context. Our borders were quite a bit different from what I've understood in those days. There weren't really immigration booths as you entered into Egypt. There already was a very large Jewish community in Alexandria. So it would have been perfectly natural that a Jewish family would show up and live in Alexandria. And that's where tradition says Jesus spent a couple years. The story makes it sound like it was just a couple months, but speculation was that it was longer than that. And at the time of Jesus, in the city of Alexandria, one of the great libraries of the world was there. Unfortunately, it burned down centuries ago, but it was very famous for a library. So it was a center of knowledge, center of learning. So maybe Jesus took his early bar mitzvah training there. We don't know. He was in Jerusalem later in life after Herod had died. So we know it's probably a few years that he lived. So that's the story of the innocents. And unfortunately, it always seems to be the babies that pay the price for our errors, doesn't it? I think if we wanted to put this story into our modern day context, oftentimes watch those films from World War II, the mothers and the babies being led off to the showers because they weren't of any worth to the Nazi Germans. It always seems like it's the children that pay the price for us adults. So, please join me in prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this Wednesday night. I give you thanks for some of the healing I'm seeing going on up at the hospital. A couple people left today, and they left rejoicing. They'd been there for a while. Continue to pray for those who are suffering from COVID and RSV, those who are there for physical training, PT. Pray for the folks on our Messiah prayer list. Pray for Lou and Wendy and Shelley and Tracy and Mike and Corey and Carlton and Bailey and Vicky and Joyce and Carol and Kay and Patty and Judy and Susan, for Pastor Scott, for Braden, and for Jean. I want to pray for Mr. George. Man, I've had a couple very interesting visits with at the hospital. I pray for his healing and his fast recovery. He is there for physical therapy. I pray for the lady in room 17 who is continuing in her hospice journey, and give thanks for the family that has surrounded her and the pastoral care that they are getting from Father Jacob from St. Mary's. I give you thanks for his important ministry. And I give you thanks for hospice. Just a wonderful, wonderful ministry. Pray for those who are out working. Give thanks for a few days of warm weather. Get a chance to take a few of the Christmas decorations down and get the yard ready down to go through the last few winter months before the beautiful spring that we anticipate. Pray for those who are journeying. Watch over them and keep them safe. Pray for the men and women in our military. Also pray for all the people on the Fresh Faith prayer list. So many prayers go up. I give you thanks for that very special spiritual group. Give thanks for Jan's successful, though difficult, medical procedure that she went through in Arizona today. I'm hoping she's getting to watch or listen tonight. Pray that her healing and recovery is quick and it is successful, and she can get back to her very active life as well. All these things, Lord, whatever else you'd have us ask, we pray in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks for tuning in, folks. I sure do appreciate it. I will see you right back here again tomorrow night for another devotion. I think we're out of saints for a while, so I have to dig up something else. So good night. God bless. See you tomorrow night.